So I wanted to talk today about something that's been in the news an awful lot for, I guess, the past couple of years. And they call it cancel culture. How many of you, just raise your hands, how many of you heard that? Heard everybody's heard of it now, right? And so I want to start, there's the story of this young man, a teen fiction writer. He writes stories and young adult fiction. And he's also a critic of some of those books. People have hired him to be what they call a sensitivity reader, to identify books that might be insensitive to particular communities. His name is Kosoko Jackson. And I guess he's in his early 20s, maybe. And as part of his work, he's tweeted things like stories about civil rights or the civil rights movement should be written by Black people. Stories of suffrage should be written by women. Ergo, he says, stories about boys during life-changing times, like the AIDS epidemic, should be written by gay men. Why is this so hard to get? He asks. So I asked too, why is that so hard to get? It makes sense to me. Yet he felt compelled to withdraw the release of his first novel, his debut novel, last year, when actually 2 years ago, when it, as according to one article, it ran afoul of the sensibilities of the Twitter gatekeeping class, which deemed it insensitive to Muslims and unduly focused on people of privilege. Now, I've never read the book, and the reason I've never read the book is because it's never been released. The story, as I understand it, was supposed to be about two young white American guys in queer men, actually, in Kosovo during the war over there. And he focused on them rather than on the terrors of the war, rather than on the Muslim community over there. And that became an issue for a lot of people. But the cancel culture gods on Twitter did their best, and he had to withdraw the book. Cancel culture is mostly, but not exclusively, online dropping or embarrassing or the shaming of a person, okay, about something. And even if we all agreed that his original tweet were true, saying that these things should be written by their own communities, I'm not saying we all agree or not, will cancel culture allow others to make observations and comments regarding groups not like themselves? But when I look at cancel culture and I see what's going on, it seems to be that the answer is no. They're not going to do that. Actually, it says no, and if you ask about it, they say, now you're officially canceled too. That's one example of him, this young man. But there's a more recent one, happened just this past week, of a young woman named Alexi Mccammon. Perhaps you know her. She's 28 years old. You might have seen her on MSNBC or read some of her articles that she's written for Axios and other magazines. She was named the Emerging Journalist of the Year by the Association of Black Journalists in 2019. She's a very good journalist. And as of this past Monday, she would have been the third Black woman to serve as the top editor for Teen Vogue. Now, I confess I do not read Teen Vogue. I've never read Teen Vogue, but maybe some of you have, and some of you have grandchildren, granddaughters who do read it. She would have been the third Black top editor for Teen Vogue at 28 years old, except about 11 years ago, when she was a teenager of 17, she made some offensive comments on her Twitter account about Asians and some slurs about the LGBTQ community. 11 years ago. And in 2019, she deleted those posts and she apologized for making them. saying that she was sorry and that she was not the same person that she was as that teenager. As I mentioned, she went on to work for Axios and MSNBC, and personally, I've always found her work to be very insightful. But when her hiring by Teen Vogue was announced, those deleted tweets resurfaced, and people had taken screenshots of them. I imagine you all know what a screenshot. You could take a picture of what's on your camera or on your phone camera or on your computer. They took screenshots of them, and apparently they saved them. For 11 years, they saved those screenshots. And this week, they decided they would repost them, and people began to demand that Teen Vogue not hire her. And again, she apologized twice profusely. But the pressure was unrelenting, and by both readers and even non-readers of Teen Vogue who'd never read it, and by at least two of Teen Vogue's major advertisers calling for her not to be hired. Even a number of people who work for Teen Vogue joined together and demanded that she not be hired. And so in a mutual agreement, she and Teen Vogue's parent company, Condé Nast, decided that it would be best if a replacement was found. Now, I don't know if she's being completely truthful about not being the same person she was 11 years ago when she was 17. Frankly, I hope not. I'd like to think that she, like most people, including us, has matured and is able to look back and admit that she did and said some things as a teenager that were wrong, that were hurtful, that were offensive. I'd like to think that deleting those tweets in 2019 was because she knew that they were wrong and not just for the sake of her career, although it was a smart move either way. But what this story and the story about Coastal Code Jackson both highlight is the power and the dangers, I believe, of cancel culture. And cancel culture isn't a new phenomenon. It's been around since the beginning of human history. Think about our ancestors living in tribes, in tribal communities. In many of those communities, cancel culture happened when a member of the tribe did something to violate a rule or a law of the tribe. And the punishment was something like banishment, kicking them out of the tribe, the removal of any kind of support from the tribe. To be banished, to be kicked out of the tribe, especially all those years ago, eons ago, was tantamount to telling the person, get out of here, go in the desert or wherever and die. Cancel culture could even take the form of a death sentence. And we see that plainly in the laws, for example, of the early Israelites. If a young woman was found not to be a virgin on her wedding night, she was supposed to be stoned. If a young man didn't obey his parents, he could be stoned. Blasphemy, you get stoned. And we still see this kind of cancel culture within certain religious groups today. Certain religious bodies like the Amish have shunning, or the Roman Catholic Church has excommunication, Jehovah's Witnesses, the Baha'i. If you violate the laws or the rules, you can be shunned or excommunicated or deemed a covenant breaker or whatever, and you're to be completely shunned and castigated. Cancel culture exists also at every level, in almost every age group, except perhaps for the littlest toddlers in the world, the children, the babies. But think about children in school. Once they hit school age, cancel culture is rampant and always has been in schools. Remember those kids who always sat alone, who were made fun of, who were bullied, and that happens today? That was cancel culture in action and still is. Maybe you were a victim of cancel culture when you were in school. Remember how it hurt? Or maybe you were one of the kids engaging in cancel culture. Are you still the same person? I know most of you, and I don't think you are if you were one of those people. I hope not. Politicians have always engaged in cancel culture. And so has the media. If you ever read any of the pamphlets, the political pamphlets that were written and distributed by politicians before and after the revolution, you'll see what I mean. or read newspaper reports from that era or later on. They were blistering. They were really awful. They really tried to bring down the people they were running against or they didn't like. And they did. They ruined the careers and the lives of many people. But with the advent of social media, things like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and TikTok and all these things, cancel culture has exploded and has become a divisive and very often a cruel tool used to cancel out those with whom other people disagree. In its purest definition, cancel culture is what they call the boycotting of a person or an organization because of an objectionable comment or act. It is the withdrawal of support, be it no longer watching films that the offending person has starred in, or books that they've written, or music they've made. Now think about some of those. Think about Michael Jackson, for example. The accusations of pedophilia, the accusations of things happening at his place, his home, none of which are ever really proven true. Not that I'm doubting or believing them, but none of those were ever proven to be true. But because of that, a lot of places won't play his music anymore. Now, I confess, I was never a Michael Jackson fan, so I didn't listen to his music anyway. But some people just stopped listening. The cancellation like that is akin to avoiding a contract. It severs ties with somebody or something that you might have previously been a fan of. I remember, I think I've told you the story when the first time I went down to Washington, D.C., and I walked into the Jefferson Memorial. There were tears in my eyes because it was the words that are written there, that are carved in that memorial, are so beautiful. And then a few years later, we started hearing more and more about Thomas Jefferson's relationship to not only Sally Hemings, but his other slaves, and that he didn't free his slaves, and so on and so forth. And boy, I was ready to cancel Thomas Jefferson right off the planet. I wanted nothing to do with him anymore. I have to say that over the years since then, I've come to a different place. That's a different sermon, perhaps, a different place with Thomas Jefferson and people like that. What that isn't, though, is call-out culture. And call-out culture is about highlighting a mistake and condemning it if it's harmful and asking them to do better, so that the individual doesn't make the same mistake or an error again. Both of those, cancel culture and call-out culture, are about public shaming. And both have been used in ways to achieve social justice in many ways. And they both become very divisive over the past year. Perhaps you remember, if you heard in the news, about the comments made by author of the Harry Potter series, J.K. Rowling, about the trans community that incensed so many people. Now, she, along with over 150 other academics and authors and writers, wrote a public letter condemning cancel culture on the basis that it threatens the right to free speech. It says that free speech is the lifeblood of a liberal society. I agree with that. Arguing that it promotes an intolerance of opposing views and a vogue for public shaming and ostracism. But to me, it's an interesting line to take, to argue that something endangers free speech by telling others that they don't have the right to theirs. So that debate is rampant. And others argue that our right to free speech doesn't make you entitled to spout hate speech. There's a trans activist, Monroe Bergdorf, and he says, cancel culture is not the same as being held accountable for your actions. And another author, Owen James, says on Twitter, all too often, cancel culture becomes a means for very rich and very powerful people to pretend they are victims when people respond to very controversial things they have used their public platform to say. And I think we've seen that on Twitter a lot over the past 4 years, particularly the past year, when certain people were, Twitter either shut them down for a while or shut them down completely, and others saying, oh, free speech, free speech. Cancel culture is about purity tests, and they're intolerant of others' observations or their viewpoints or comments. There's a New York Times columnist, Jennifer Senior, and she wrote this. She says, purity tests are the tools of cancel culture fanatics, and the quest for purity ultimately becomes indistinguishable from the quest for power. The diehards in this army of crusaders will argue they're doing it in the name of diversity, but it's really just the opposite. At his foundation's 2019 summit, President Obama critiqued the phenomenon of cancel culture among young people in their use of social media, saying that it promoted a false sense of activism that doesn't actually bring about change. And the urbandictionary.com sums up cancel culture like this. It says, it's a desire to cancel out a person or a community from social media platforms, especially when they are shown to be wrong about something. And The Daily, which is a New York Times podcast, spent 2 episodes on cancel culture and said, the word cancel refers to total disinvestment in something. And they pointed to the examples of Taylor Swift, who was canceled for, I think, not supporting Donald Trump. She instead supported Mr. Biden. And Kanye West, who, again, I don't listen to his music, so I really have no investment in him otherwise. J.K. Rowling. They've even tried it with Bill Gates, Shania Twain, and others for things that they upset the masses on social media. How many of you remember the Dixie Chicks when they said what they said about President Trump? In he was president by then. President Trump in was it Trump or Bush? Bush. I'm sorry, about President Bush and the war, and how suddenly country music stations would not play their music anymore, and they were canceled for a very long time. They made a comeback, and in fact, they even changed their name from the Dixie Chicks to just the Chicks. They dropped the Dixie because it's offensive. It's an amazing phenomenon to watch people be piled on by these digital mobs who want to cry out for justice. And it makes me wonder, is this justice? Is there anything positive about cancel culture? There's power in it that's being harnessed, and when we expose serious wrongdoing and injustice, I suppose that's good. The fact that this power is also coming from a collection of everyday people like us, who alone may not be able to have an impact. So they join together, and they do. And so for those caught in it, it becomes a real consequence. But what about the more debatable ideas, the debatable cases where someone simply shares an unpopular idea, or they disagree with the politics of the majority who are taking place in canceling out people? And even in the big, more understandable cases, should someone be canceled forever? I mean, think about that second definition from the Times podcast. Total disinvestment in something or someone or anything. Total. That's a big qualifier. Complete separation. Complete departure. Absolute cutting off. That's a strong sentiment to apply to people. I mean, it's scary to imagine the mob coming after us, especially when we may have said or done some things in our past that we don't want to be discovered. Certainly, the age of social media has really charged up and increased the speed and impact of someone being canceled. Is it really new, though? We've already seen it isn't. Cancel culture taps into the feelings of shame we all experience when we're confronted with something or offensive or hurtful that we might have said or done. But shame is rarely a useful tool in any real way. It rarely helps people to learn or change. The author and the lecturer Brene Brown has this to say about shame and guilt. She says, we think that shaming is a great moral compass, that we can shame people into being better, but that's not true. Here's a great example, she says, that comes up a lot when I'm talking about parenting. You have a kid who tells a lie. So you shame that child and say, you're a liar. Shame corrodes that part of us that thinks we can be different. If I'm a liar, if that's who I am, how do I ever change? How do I ever make a different decision? This is versus you're a good person and you told a lie, and that behavior is not okay in this family. Everyone needs a platform, she says, of self-worth from which to see change. Shame is different than guilt, she says, which can prompt positive behavior. When we see people apologizing, making amends, and changing their behavior, that is always around guilt. Guilt, the whole I am bad, is not easy. It creates psychological pain. I have done something that is inconsistent or incongruous with my values or who I want to be. When we apologize or make amends for something we've done and change our behavior, guilt is the driving force. It's a positive, socially adaptive experience. According to the stories that we read about Jesus of Nazareth, he encountered a lot of people who were being punished or cast away from society because they had upset the mob, primarily by the religious leaders. Zacchaeus is one story. Maybe some of you know the story of Zacchaeus. He was a tax collector. He was a Jew, yet he collected taxes for the Romans, and people hated him. Mary, who was the Mary who washed Jesus's feet with the oil that she had, and dried his feet with her hair. And then you remember Judas, who everybody, well, they think they know what Judas did. Judas says, why would you let her do that? We could have sold that oil for a lot of money. He was ready to cast her out. Jesus didn't do that. And then there's a story about the thief on the cross, or the Samaritan woman at the well. Samaritans were already canceled out by the Jews. And she came, and Jesus was talking to her. Maybe you know that story. He was talking to her. You remember the folk song? Maybe you've heard Pete Seeger or Peter, Paul, and Mary sing it. Well, Jesus, he met the woman at the well. Well, Jesus met this woman at the well, and they were talking. And she said, I've never heard anyone speak like you. And she realized that he was the Messiah. And he said, now that you recognize that, go and get your husband. And she looked ashamed, and she said, I don't have a husband. He said, that's true. You've had 5 husbands, which in the Jewish tradition is, you don't do that. And so he forgave her, though. He didn't cancel her. But one of the most familiar stories in this regard is the story of the woman caught in adultery. And it's probably familiar to a lot of you, but I want to read it to you anyway. It's from the book of John, the Gospel of John, chapter 8. And it says this. It says, at dawn, Jesus appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. Different woman, different story. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say? They were always doing this. They're trying to trap him. They were using this question, it says, as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. And at this, those who heard began to go away, one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" And she says, "No one, sir." And he says, "Then neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin." See, they were trying to put Jesus in a tough spot. If he agrees with the mob, he affirms that their approach to punishing sinners, and if he disagrees, they will accuse him of condoning adultery or rejecting his own religion, specifically the law of Moses. And mobs can be very persuasive, like he does in a lot of instances. He finds a third way. Now, he challenges them with a question that gets at the heart of how we should act in an age of cancel culture. That he who is without sin cast the first stone. And we don't know for sure what Jesus was writing in the dirt, but one of the most popular ideas is that he simply began by writing the list of sins that maybe some of them had committed, and they were confronted with their own hypocrisy until none of them were left. And repeatedly, Jesus and other writers in the Christian scriptures remind people of the danger in judging other people, especially those who don't identify as part of the beloved community we're part of. Jesus says we should forgive 70 times 7. Now, some people say, okay, I'm up to 462. He's got a few more forgivenesses happening there. It doesn't mean that literally. It just means we forgive. We forgive. And it's not easy. It tells us to recognize the log in our own eyes before pulling the log, the speck out of someone else's. But in the eyes of cancel culture, people are reduced to either good or bad people. It's almost like airbrushing someone out of a picture or photoshopping them out of a photo. And that's not to say that individuals shouldn't be held accountable when they have a questionable view or do something wrong, but there's a difference between being canceled and being called out, being held accountable. And call-out culture is just that, the idea that we can challenge someone's opinion or action without deleting them, leaving them, and perhaps us, room to grow or learn. I mean, there are people that I disagree with, that I'm not fond of, that I can still learn from, that still have good ideas. And maybe I'm just not listening properly. Maybe I'm not listening well. Calling out, though, isn't always necessarily gentle, trying to have a conversation, although that's a good way to start. It often requires really being stern and speaking prophetically. And again, I want to read something from the Christian scriptures where Jesus speaks, and this is in the book of Matthew, chapter 23. It says this, and this is sometimes called the 7 woes to the Pharisees that Jesus said. Said, then Jesus said to his disciples and the crowds, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, so you must be careful to do everything they tell you, but do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Everything they do is done for people to see. They make their phylacteries, the things that they wrap around their arms in the morning. They make their phylacteries, lost my place here. Yeah, wide, and the tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to be called rabbi by others. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers and sisters. And do not call anyone on earth father, for you have one Father, and he is in heaven, mothers too. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And then he says this: Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You travel over land and sea to win a single convert, and when you succeeded, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are. Woe to you, blind guides! You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing, but anyone who swears by the gold of the temple is bound by that oath. You blind fools! Which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing, but anyone who swears by the gift on the altar is bound by that oath. You blind men! Which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? Therefore, anyone who swears by the temple swears by it, and anyone who dwells in it. And anyone who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and by the one who sits on it. And he continues, he says, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat but swallow a camel. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they're full of greed and indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside will also be cleaned. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs. I always like the King James Version there, where it says, you are like whited sepulchres. It just sounded better. You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You build tombs for the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous. And you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are the descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Go ahead then and complete what your ancestors started. You snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell? Therefore, I am sending you prophets and sages and teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Others you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town. And so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly, I tell you, this will all come on your generation. Now that's calling out in a stern way. I doubt that reasoning with them would have worked. They were already intent on killing Jesus. And I don't know if any of them ever went away from one of those sessions with him saying, you know, he has a point. Maybe I should change my ways. But think about that story again of the woman caught in adultery. After all the Pharisees and the others who wanted to stone her had left, Jesus didn't use this kind of calling out. Instead, he just said, I don't condemn you. Just don't do it anymore. To be honest, we don't know what happened to that woman. We don't know who she was or if she listened to Jesus, but by not condemning her, he was not only calling her out. I mean, the story doesn't say that she denied her actions or tried to excuse them, so she apparently knew that she was wrong, but he was calling her in. calling her into a new way of living, a community, a beloved community. And even those Pharisees that he called out were called in along with the Romans when he forgave them while being crucified. Calling in is what our first and second principles are about. The inherent worth and dignity of every person, and justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. Calling in is what we mean when we speak about the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process, the goal of world community with peace and liberty and justice. And as people of a liberal religious tradition, we are about calling people in. Yes, we also call people out. We hold people accountable. Being called out has made me a better person, said one celebrity on Twitter. Not being canceled has enabled me to be accountable, learn from my mistakes, and go on to share those lessons with others and do good with my privilege. Most of us have the potential to do that. There will always be, yes, there will always be individuals and groups of people who will not respond to being called out. Some of those individual groups are very dangerous. White supremacists, racists, and yet there are even instances where some of those people have responded to being called out. I'm sure you've seen the stories about some of those individuals who were involved with, say, the neo-Nazi groups or the KKK, and who were called out and called in, and who have in fact turned their lives around, who've made amends, and who are now working to combat the racism and hatred that they once espoused. And I'm not saying that canceling is always bad. I know some people say that it's an infringement on speech, on free speech. But I'm okay, I think, for me anyway, I'm okay when private companies like Amazon or Twitter or Facebook, and believe me, they're no gems, but when they deny a platform to hate mongers and won't sell their books or their merchandise or give them a platform to spew it, I'm okay with that. Or when they take it away and deny them access. They are, after all, private companies, and those folk can find a different platform to work with, and there will always be one, or they will start one like they did with the short-lived Parler. Remember Parler? I don't know if you do remember that. There will always be those with whom we disagree. Sometimes that disagreement would be so great that we might have reason to cancel. But what we need to do is to find a way to cancel what they're saying or propagating without necessarily canceling out the human being that they are. Certainly at times, we need to have nothing to do with certain people. We need to stay away from them. But our UU values call us to always be open to forgiveness, to reaching out in our efforts to make the world a better place, and to bring about our ideal of the beloved community. May it be so.
If you like this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video.